There are three specific items sitting in your kitchen right now that are deliberately lowering your biological frequency, functioning as a structural interference pattern that you never agreed to. The individuals and systems who designed the modern food supply knew exactly what they were doing, because the architectural blueprints for this interference were documented in ancient texts that institutional powers spent centuries trying to erase. These are texts that explain why the earliest spiritual teachers instructed their inner circles to avoid specific foods, not for conventional physical health, weight loss, or moral purity, but for pure energetic preservation. They understood that these specific substances would not simply harm the body, but would silence the biological signal. That distinct frequency you have been sensing, that subtle ringing tone that seems to arrive at the exact moments you are seeking higher understanding, is actively being blocked. It is being jammed, not by accident, not by random coincidence, but by a highly calculated structural design. Tonight, you are going to understand the exact mechanics of how three specific categories of food were embedded into every modern diet, specifically to keep human consciousness locked out of its natural, higher bandwidth. Before we examine the biochemical reality of your pantry, we must establish a clear boundary. This explanation is not about physical weight loss, mainstream dietary trends, or traditional nutritional science. This is strictly about the mechanics of human energy, the suppression of the biological antenna, and the historical records that prove this suppression was intentional. If you are looking for a standard health tutorial, this information is not for you. But if you want to understand the invisible forces governing human perception, pay close attention. To understand why physical foods can block your access to non-physical source energy, you must first understand what happened to the original teachings regarding the human vessel. In the Gospel of Thomas, specifically saying number 70, there is a statement that conventional scholars have argued about for generations. It reads, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have will kill you." Mainstream interpretation has always assumed this was a metaphor for faith, belief, or moral character. But the early practitioners who preserved this text understood it as literal, mechanical instruction. They were referring to the divine spark, the piece of the original source frequency that exists inside the human architecture. And the warning was highly specific. This spark could be suffocated. It could not be destroyed, but it could be rendered dormant, put to sleep, and made entirely unreachable, even though it remains perfectly intact. How exactly do you suffocate a frequency? How do you block a broadcast signal that is fundamentally non-physical? You do not attack the signal. You target the receiver. You alter the biological instrument so that it can no longer tune to the broadcast bandwidth. The human body is not merely an assembly of flesh, bone, and chemical reactions. It is a highly sophisticated biological antenna. Every cell, every organ, and every neurological pathway is meticulously designed to receive, process, and transmit energetic information. When you are vibrating at your natural, unaltered frequency, when your biological receiver is clear and unobstructed, the source signal comes through with perfect clarity. You experience this as profound intuition, unexplainable synchronicities, and a deep internal knowing that entirely bypasses rational, linear thought. However, when certain foreign substances enter your biological system, substances that vibrate at the dense frequencies of control, lethargy, and disconnection, your internal antenna becomes jammed. The original source is still broadcasting, the higher frequency is still transmitting, but you can no longer perceive it. The internal static becomes far too loud. This concept is not an ancient superstition. It is the fundamental mechanics of energy. The entities and forces that design the systems of limitation in this material realm understood these mechanics long before human beings developed the scientific language to describe them. The Nag Hammadi Library, an astonishing collection of ancient manuscripts discovered in 1945, buried deep in a sealed clay jar in the Egyptian desert, contains a profound text known as On the Origin of the World. In this manuscript, the ruling forces of the material matrix are described not merely as political authorities, but as systemic architects. They do not simply govern the physical world, they engineer it. They structure the exact conditions required to keep human consciousness trapped within a fog of localized forgetting. And according to these texts, one of their most effective tools of suppression is human consumption. The manuscript details how these architectural forces introduced highly specific substances into the human ecosystem to create what they termed the veil. This veil was not described as a physical wall in the sky, but as an internal, energetic dampening field that makes it nearly impossible for the human nervous system to perceive anything beyond the immediate 5 physical senses. For centuries, academic scholars assumed this ancient description was purely metaphorical. They believed it represented psychological temptation, moral weakness, or the general struggle of the human condition. But those who actually studied frequency, who practically applied the techniques of purification outside the rigid structures of institutional religion, understood that this was a literal, operational manual. There are 3 exact substances, 3 distinct categories of consumption that create the densest interference patterns within the human energetic system. All 3 were systematically prohibited in the private, advanced instructions given to those seeking to maintain the highest possible frequency. These instructions were never meant for the general crowds, but were reserved for those capable of understanding frequency mechanics. Today, these 3 exact substances are inescapable. Walk into any standard grocery store, select almost any packaged product, and read the ingredient list. You will find at least one of these 3 elements engineered into almost everything designed for mass public consumption. This is not the result of an accidental supply chain shortage, nor is it merely a matter of economic convenience for food manufacturers. This is a strategic architectural deployment. Once you understand the explicit mechanism of what these 3 substances do to your cellular antenna, your relationship with the modern food supply will be permanently altered. Before revealing the first substance, it is vital to understand the precise mechanism of action. How does digesting a physical item block a non-physical wave of energy? The answer is found in what can be described as structural energetic encoding. Every physical substance in the universe carries a base vibration, a specific energetic signature that goes far beyond its mere chemical composition. When you consume a piece of food, you are not simply absorbing physical vitamins, minerals, or calories. You are actively integrating its energetic frequency into your own biological field. Foods that occur naturally, growing from the earth without heavy industrial interference, carry frequencies that are either neutral or highly resonant with the human body. Fresh spring water, an apple picked from a tree, or raw almonds. These substances do not create static. They provide biological fuel while supporting the clarity of the receiver. But there is a secondary category of substances. These are items that do not and cannot occur anywhere in the natural world. They are the direct result of extreme industrial processing, chemical extraction, and molecular manipulation. Because of the violence of their creation, these substances carry a disrupted, dense energetic signature. When you consume these industrialized elements regularly, multiple times a day as the modern system encourages, your entire biological frequency begins to lower to match their density. You literally drop out of the higher bandwidth. Once you are vibrating at this heavily processed, dense level, the clear intuition stops. The internal guidance fades. You become completely dependent on external authorities, screens, and systems to tell you what is real, simply because your internal receiver is no longer functioning. This mechanical reality is exactly why these teachings were aggressively hidden. This is why institutional councils in the 4th century ordered the destruction of any text detailing this specific biological process. If the general population understood that their profound sense of disconnection, anxiety, and spiritual blindness was being actively maintained through their daily diet, they would immediately stop consuming the interference. They would stop feeding the economic system, and the entire structure of engineered control would lose its grip. Here is exactly how this interference is deployed. The first substance that was heavily warned against, the first item strictly avoided by early practitioners seeking energetic clarity, is refined industrial crystal. I am not referring to the crystals you meditate with. I am referring to the hyper-processed crystal that is hidden in nearly every product within the modern diet. The crystal that biologically hooks into your neurology, hijacking your dopamine receptors to create permanent loops of craving, dependence, and energetic collapse. I am talking about refined, bleached, white industrial sugar. To be absolutely clear on the definition, this is not the natural fructose found in whole fruit. This is not raw honey, organic maple syrup, or natural cane. This is the highly industrialized result of taking plant material and subjecting it to extreme chemical refining, bleaching, and crystallization until it becomes a pure, white, granular isolate that does not exist anywhere in the natural ecosystem. The extreme mechanical violence of that refining process strips away all life force, leaving behind a substance encoded with the frequency of pure craving. The mechanism of this interference is highly aggressive. When refined industrial sugar enters your bloodstream, it does not merely spike your physical glucose levels. It creates what ancient practitioners referred to as energetic shackles. It forces your biological system into a violent spike of artificial energy, inevitably followed by a crushing, exhausting crash. In this constant state of biological emergency, the body's entire energetic focus is forced downward, constantly scrambling to stabilize the physical vessel. Your system becomes entirely dependent on the temporary rush. In that deep dependency, biological sovereignty is lost. Your choices are no longer your own. The molecular craving is driving your behavior. This is not poetry. Anyone who has attempted to completely eliminate refined white sugar from their diet knows that the withdrawals are not just physical headaches. They are deeply psychological and energetic. It is the dense frequency fighting to maintain its anchor in your system. The Gospel of Philip, another profoundly misunderstood ancient text, contains a passage stating that the ruling powers cannot see those who are clothed in the perfect light, and that one must put on that light to remain unseen by the systems of control. For generations, this was interpreted as an instruction to be morally good. But it is actually a lesson in frequency physics. The perfect light is the high bandwidth source frequency. You cannot hold that high frequency, you cannot put on that light, if your biological receiver is constantly flooded with an industrial chemical that forces your nervous system into chronic exhaustion and density. Think about a standard day. How many times does this refined industrial crystal enter the human system? In morning coffee, in processed bread, in pasta sauces, in perceived health foods like yogurt and protein bars. It is consumed 10 to 20 times a day by the average person. And with every single hit, the static increases, and the internal signal is pushed further away. The second substance is fundamentally more pervasive, far more deliberately integrated into the food supply, and devastatingly effective at crippling the biological antenna. In the secret book of John, there is a complex section describing how the architectural forces created forgetfulness in the human population. They did not do it through military force or physical chains. They did it through a process the text calls mixture. They took something that appeared natural and pure and forcefully mixed it with something dense and destructive, creating a hybrid element that looks beneficial on the surface but carries a corrupted encoding underneath. For centuries, theologians assumed this passage was an allegory for mixing truth with lies. But when examined through the lens of energetic mechanics, it becomes a literal description of biological corruption. The second substance that destroys the human receiver is corrupted, highly processed industrial oil. Let us define the boundary here. This is not natural fat. This is not the pure oil gently pressed from olives, avocados, or coconuts. This is the modern invention of industrial seed and vegetable oils. Canola oil, soybean oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, and sunflower oil. These oils do not exist in nature in liquid form. You cannot simply squeeze a kernel of corn or a soybean and extract a jar of oil. The creation of these substances requires massive industrial machinery, toxic petroleum-based chemical solvents like hexane, extreme high-heat processing, and chemical deodorizers just to make the final product fit for human consumption. This violent manufacturing process fundamentally mutates the molecular structure of the fat. The mechanism of how this blocks your frequency is found in your cellular biology. Every single cell in your body, every nerve sheath in your brain, and every hormonal pathway in your system is physically constructed from lipids, or fats. When you consume natural, undamaged fats, your body builds strong, clear, flexible cellular membranes that allow electrical and energetic signals to flow seamlessly. But when you consume these mutated, highly processed industrial oils, your body has no choice but to use that corrupted material to build your cells. Imagine trying to listen to a high-definition radio broadcast using a speaker with a cracked, melted internal wire. The radio station is broadcasting perfectly. The signal is strong, but the physical receiver is physically broken, so all you hear is distorted, violent static. This is exactly what happens when your cellular membranes are constructed from biologically corrupted fats. The source frequency is trying to reach you, but your cells physically cannot translate the signal into conscious awareness because their very architecture has been compromised. In the Pistis Sophia, an extensive ancient text concerning the mechanics of reality, there is a detailed discourse regarding the purification of the physical vessel. It explains that certain earthly substances create what are translated as shadow layers within the energetic body. These layers act like a dirty window. They do not block the light completely, but they dim it, filter it, and distort it until the individual eventually forgets how bright the light used to be. Corrupted industrial oils create these shadow layers faster and more permanently than almost any other substance, because they do not just pass through your digestive tract. They are physically integrated into the walls of your brain and nervous system. If your biological walls are built from corrupted, industrialized material, you become a walking interference pattern. You will find these oils in nearly every packaged item in the modern kitchen: crackers, chips, salad dressings, bread, and frozen meals. Every time they are consumed, the veil of forgetfulness is reinforced. The third category is the most fiercely protected, the most culturally ingrained, and the most biochemically disruptive to the high-frequency antenna. This specific substance will trigger immediate psychological defense mechanisms because the human population has been deeply conditioned to believe it is not only healthy, but absolutely vital for survival. But the mechanics of energy tell a completely different, much darker story. In the Testimony of Truth, a highly guarded ancient manuscript, there is a passage that explicitly details how the forces of density convinced humanity to consume the flesh of sacrifice. The text explains that this consumption acts as an energetic binding, an invisible anchor that locks the human consciousness to the lowest, most dense frequencies of the material realm, making the elevation of consciousness nearly impossible. While historians dismiss this as a critique of ancient temple rituals, those who understand frequency know it is a direct warning against the daily, normalized consumption of terror. The third substance is the flesh of commercially slaughtered animals. To understand this without triggering modern dietary tribalism, we must look purely at the biochemical mechanism. This is not an argument about environmentalism, animal rights, or ethical philosophy. This is cold, hard frequency mechanics. When an animal is subjected to the modern industrial slaughterhouse process, it experiences profound, unavoidable terror. In the final moments of its life, its biological system floods with immense amounts of survival hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, and extreme stress chemicals. Because of the nature of the industrial kill line, the animal dies while its system is saturated in the biochemistry of absolute fear. These extreme survival hormones do not just magically evaporate when the animal dies. They are biologically baked into the muscle tissue. They are encoded into the flesh at a molecular level. When a human being consumes that mass-produced flesh, they are not simply acquiring grams of protein. They are literally ingesting the biochemical and energetic imprint of terror, suffering, and death. You are taking the lowest, most dense vibrational frequency possible, the frequency of ultimate physical trauma, and forcing your biological antenna to process and integrate it. The Gospel of the Ebionites, a text so controversial it was systematically hunted down and only survives in fragments preserved by the very institutions trying to destroy it, records clear instructions to cease the consumption and sacrifice of animal flesh. The early communities that followed these specific teachings practiced strict avoidance of this flesh, not because they were punishing themselves, but for strict frequency maintenance. They understood an immutable law of physics. You cannot hold a high, pure, refined energetic frequency while simultaneously using your digestive system to process the biological markers of terror and death. The two frequencies are fundamentally incompatible. One attempts to pull you up toward clarity and source connection. The other acts as a heavy lead weight, dragging your consciousness back down into the dense, reactive, fear-based matrix of basic material survival. This specific teaching remains the most aggressively suppressed because it directly threatens the largest, most profitable, and most deeply entrenched industries on the planet. Sugar can be swapped for artificial sweeteners. Industrial oils can be slowly phased out. But the animal agriculture complex represents trillions of dollars, massive governmental subsidies, and centuries of deep psychological conditioning. The system has convinced you that this consumption is your identity, your tradition, and your biological necessity. But when you analyze the situation purely through the lens of cause and effect, the mechanism becomes undeniable. Every time you flood your digestive system with the flesh of fear, your internal frequency drops to process the dense material. You become heavier, more lethargic, and more prone to anxiety and reactionary emotions. You become completely trapped in the lower bandwidths of survival consciousness, and that high, clear, ringing tone of the source frequency becomes nothing more than a faint whisper you can no longer decipher. Institutional structures spent thousands of years removing these specific mechanical instructions from the public record. They kept the texts that promoted obedience, blind faith, and submission to external authority. But they systematically deleted the instructions regarding biological purification because those instructions gave the individual direct, unmediated power. If your antenna is clear, you do not need an institution to tell you what the truth is. You can feel it, hear it, and access it directly. I am not presenting this information to dictate your dietary choices. I am presenting the mechanical blueprints of the interference pattern that was hidden from you. What you choose to do with this data is a matter of your own sovereign will. But if you have been feeling the subtle shifts in reality, if you have been sensing that profound ringing, and if you have recognized that an invisible barrier is preventing your full cognitive and spiritual expansion, you now possess the schematic of that barrier. refined industrial crystal sugar, corrupted molecular seed oils, and the biochemically traumatized flesh of factory slaughter. 3 highly engineered structural blockers, seamlessly integrated into the daily routine of modern life. The effect of removing these 3 substances from your biological system is not subtle, and it does not take years to manifest. Within a matter of days, the physical vessel begins to clear the static. The first measurable effect is the return of the signal. That subtle ringing tone, the background frequency of pure awareness, becomes steady and accessible. The second effect is the lifting of the cognitive fog. The chronic, low-level confusion and exhaustion that you assumed was just a normal part of aging completely evaporates. Your mind becomes a sharp, precise instrument. The third effect is the spontaneous acceleration of synchronicity. When your antenna is no longer bogged down by the dense frequencies of industrial corruption and fear, you naturally align with the flow of the broader universe. You will face resistance. You will experience mental pushback telling you that this is too extreme, that a little bit of poison will not hurt, or that you should just conform to the convenience of the modern world. Recognize that resistance for what it is. The ingrained programming of the interference pattern trying to maintain its grip on your consciousness. The source is always broadcasting. The frequency is always available. The only variable is whether or not you are willing to clear the static from your own receiver. If this explanation has provided the missing piece you have been searching for, share your thoughts below. Subscribe to this channel if you want to understand the deeper mechanics of reality that have been hidden in plain sight. Protect your antenna, question your consumption, and prepare for the transmissions to come.